So our next speaker is Fraser Sailing, who queued himself up with this question. So, Fraser's, you can see the title of his talk, I won't read it to you, but Fraser's worked on a lot of assessments over the years. He's put together handbooks on watershed assessment, and so he's going to talk to us about some of the lessons he's learned and pitfalls and opportunities that he's come across in his career. Fraser's right here at UC Davis.
Is this loud enough? I can't hear it.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Just kidding. Obtrusive. All right. So I wanted to acknowledge some people down here at the bottom. By the way, I'm in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy here on campus. And Yara Locker, Susanna Cardenas, and David Waitchen have worked with me over the last several years, and have contributed to how these ideas have evolved. And then a variety of partners from different organizations and agencies have helped with different projects, and based on the name of the organization, you might be able to tell in the next couple of slides what part they helped me with. And when I was putting this together, I remember that I presented here in 2007, and a lot of the things I'm talking about now have evolved since then, but have, for me it was a nice reminder as to how these things all evolve over time. So that was the first time that I presented some of these ideas 7 years ago. I wanted to go over a few definitions so that these aren't globally required definitions. These are my definitions for today, but they're consistent with most of the uses of these terms. Metrics, things that we measure in the wild. Sometimes a metric is an indicator, but really an indicator is something you've picked because it tells you a story that you can convey, hopefully, to other people. Performance measures, that term, performance measures are really indicators of management usually. Sometimes the term performance measure is used to apply to performance of a watershed or a natural system. Quite often it's used to apply to management activities. And then index is an aggregation of indicators. An indicator can be an aggregation of metrics. When people, sometimes they use an indicator, say fish populations is my indicator, or BMI is my indicator, nothing back with vertebrate, then they may be talking about an indicator as an aggregation of metrics, in which case its function is similar to an index. So these terms are a little bit squishy, and you'll see if you read across the literature, you'll see that that's true. But one of the things an index is supposed to do is tell you a more complete story. That doesn't mean it's always an accurate story. So not a precise story if you look at Brock's interesting diagram at the end, but it's supposed to be more complete because you've got more words in the sentence. So you can imagine if you had a 20-word sentence that tells a story, a very nice story about something, and you pick 10 of those words at random, you may or may not get the meaning of the story. If you pick 3 of them, you probably won't get the meaning of the story. So the index is supposed to be more comprehensive as well as an aggregation of the indicators. So some of the places that I've developed these ideas, this has really been all over the state, and some of the projects have been state scale. So the last 12, 13 years, between the Yuba and Feather in the Bay Area and the Sacramento River in Southern California, LA, and the river watersheds, I've been working on these ideas with different partners that I acknowledged earlier. And the reason, and also at the state scale, the reason I'm bringing this up is that these ideas have been put in front of a lot of people, and a lot of these organizations and places have absorbed and rolled them into their way of doing things. So I think what I'm talking about is now a part of the state of the practice. These are some of the report cards that have come out of this work, and this is an example of part of a report card. It doesn't have a grades column, but it shows one way of organizing information, which I'll get into a second. This is from the Feather River report card, part of the Sacramento River watershed, and it's organizing objectives here by goal. So we have different goals for the watershed, and we organize our objectives to correspond to those. Around the world, indicators have been used in a lot of ways, and one really important lesson from looking at all of these different ways that people have used indicators is there's not a consistent pattern. It's not helpful literature It's not an easy literature. So whether you're looking globally or within California, the approaches that people have used are really all over the map. And that's a big problem in my mind, because it says that we haven't really found a way to deal with this. There's not a solution to some of the challenges that Brock raised. Within California, we're just in the same place as globally. There's not a consistent way that the field has evolved and that people are doing things. But now we're getting closer to a scale where you want that. Because if you're going to have interregional division of money or other things, then you want to have comparability across the state, and you need a method that allows you to do that. Here are some of the ways the state looks at things. Across the top are the different agencies. Across the bottom are different domains, things that we're interested in. Sometimes they have the same words. And in the middle are the types of reporting or report cards that are generated. And the arrows indicate who does what, and then what domains are contained within those reporting or report cards. And again, there's no consistent way that this is done across these different domains or agencies. So why do we want consistency? Well, I'll say what these terms are. We're often asked to integrate information and tell a story to a decision maker. If we don't do that, then they're gonna mess up anyway, but that means they're more likely to mess up, and they are more able to rationalize their messing up if they say, you never told me that in the first place. So as an incredibly optimistic scientist, we want to provide them with the information in a way they can understand. So you have the IBI, Index of Biological Integrity, or the Health and Extreme Condition Index. You might have an air quality index, a water quality index, some measure of hydrogeomorphology or productivity index. So each of these may be an index. And then we have the further problem of whether or not and how we can combine these dissimilar things together. Sometimes these indices have dissimilar components within them already, such as a water quality index. You might have biological, chemical, physical characteristics within that. But usually they're designed to address a particular process or concern, like a legal concern, such as water quality or air quality. So how do we integrate the parts? I'm going to go through some possibilities. Here's some examples of indicators expressed in different ways, just to show the variety of the sort of the barrage of information that we have to be the filter for, so that we're not just slapping people with graphs and maps. So for example, here's mercury in fish in different subwatersheds of the feather. Here's changes in bird species richness over time. Here's a map of school lunch programs in a watershed. Here's the change in carbon capture in a subwatershed over time. So there's all these different types of information and scales, temporal scales, and geographic scales that the data are collected in, and we have this aggregation problem to deal with. So I'm going to talk about some problems with that and some ways maybe we can solve it. So aggregation depends on really having a good process. This isn't the only way to do it, this sentence here, which you're probably reading while I'm saying it, but there's a variety of things that you should take into account when considering aggregating, including the caveats or the cautions that Brock raised earlier. So one way to do this is to start out with your goals. In all the projects that I've been involved in, this is the starting condition, is that you have a set of goals and objectives, because that's really what defines people's concern, why they're going to listen, and decision making and funding and all of regulatory activity are based on stated or unstated social goals and objectives. So these colors might be your goals here, and within a goal, like we want to protect water quality for drinking, you might have a series of objectives, such as we want to keep nitrate concentrations below certain thresholds. And each of those goals and objectives will have a set of indicators corresponding to them. So one way to organize this is to think about the goals going in this direction. So we have a goal, like let's say the first one here is our goal related to drinking water quality, and then you have a series of objectives and then a set of indicators. And so you can aggregate these indicators going in this direction. Let's call Y an aggregation exercise corresponding to this goal. Your goals are one axis, You might also have a series of what we might call scientific domains, such as physical, chemical properties, or landscape condition, or things that don't necessarily have goals associated with them. They're going to have indicators corresponding to them in this axis, so you can also calculate an index for water quality or landscape condition independently of the goal. While you're doing this, I had the challenge of Napa County clients said, well, can you explain this to our board of supervisors? I said, no. So if you're following along here, we take this table, this two-dimensional indicator matrix. We also have influences on condition. There are a lot of different influences, and some of these I for influence they're different from each other on different indicators that you're measuring, and sometimes they're the same. Climate change is often thought of as an influence. It has influences, but often it's changing something that then has an influence. So this axis, the I-axis, is also very complicated. It's usually not addressed very well. There's really not a good model for how we deal with all of this, so I'm really presenting something graphically that hasn't always been sorted out. So when we talk about goals and objectives as really important social statements, we're really talking about intersecting with social political process, which even if you're just out counting bugs all day, you're doing it for that reason, whether you think you are or want to or not. Somebody hopefully is looking at your data and appreciating it. So if we pick something related to bugs, this column, this row right here, across these are just example projects that I was involved in simultaneously. They each had their own stakeholder process in Southern California, Sacramento River, and North Bay. And the independent stakeholder processes came up with essentially very similar goals. They're mom and, I like to say mom and dad, because I'm a dad, and apple pie kind of goals. So here we have protect fish and wildlife, protect aquatic and terrestrial species, protect plant, fish, and wildlife. And so we find a lot of commonality around the state. If we can explain our work in terms of these goals and objectives as indicators that allow us to measure these things, then we've made a connection to what people care about. Measuring performance. And so this is a really critical area I'm going to spend a few minutes with. We're almost always, when we're measuring performance, we're always comparing against some threshold or standard. If we weren't doing that, people really wouldn't care as much. And so an example might be, hey, we protected 23 acres of wetland. That's really, really important if there are 27 acres of wetland left in the world. It's less important if there's 23 million acres of wetland left in the world. So putting our activities in the context of some kind of condition threshold or reference condition is really important because it allows people to interpret what we're talking about. And so in order to do this, we need a method for controlling for these differences among indicators and also for geography. I'm not going to talk as much about that, but in order to do this and to make what we're talking about seem relevant, we're measuring ecological performance, we need a method for doing this. And so here's a graph that shows what I'm talking about. So we're often concerned about condition and trend in something. What are those three? PPT. So it could be, oh God, I use an acronym I have to remember it. Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera? I love bugs. So we're interested in condition and trend in something, and we have an idea what a good condition might be. This might be historical condition or attainment of a beneficial use. There was a really interesting paper in one of the ESA journals, Ecological Society of America journals, about historical versus attainable conditions for rivers. So we have an idea of what these reference conditions might be from a good point of view. Less often, or less well defined, we have an idea of what a poor condition is, but usually we're interested in wherever we are in time. So here's the time axis. Are we getting close to our good spot, and are we going away from our bad spot? So an improving condition, we're going away from the poor condition. A degrading condition, we're going away from the good condition up here. So we need to solve that problem in measuring things somehow. With individual indicators, and I'll bring this all together in a moment, with individual indicators, some of the things we measure are very sensitive to change, environmental change, and so you might have very steep slopes when you change things slightly, such as road density or parcelization or nitrogen in the water or something like that. You might have steep slopes. So you have a sensitive indicator, but it might also be a noisy indicator, and it's challenging later on if you're talking about index formulation. If you have an index, it might be less noisy and less responsive to change, but now you have maybe something, if this was an index, that has more components to it, and so maybe it's telling you a little more complete story. The one important thing about all this is that different indicators have different response patterns to some kind of influence, land use change, water change, etc. So your score, let's call it your sustainability score, how good are we being at sustainability, may not vary linearly with your parameter value, the thing you're measuring. And because we have these different shapes, it requires treating each of our, if we're going to aggregate, we have to treat these properly so that we can aggregate them together. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but you can read up on it in the Water Plan Update 2013 Sustainability Indicator Framework. So how do we do this aggregation? Well, the main thing that people do is use one of these steps for transformation of data. Here are some of them. Ranking. This is basically taking all your values and putting them in rank order. Empirical, which is to find your minimum and maximum values in your study area and use those as your endpoints. Axiological, which is highlighted because I'm going to talk about it more. Mathematical, which means you're using some kind of function to turn your parameter values into something meaningful like an indicator score. And statistical, meaning you're using the mean and standard or variance or standard deviation away from the mean as the way that you do your scoring. Axiological normalization, which is highlighted here and described because I think it's the best one, is defined here, and as far as I can tell, this is the main use of this approach and definition in the global literature, is the relative distance between good and bad conditions, which are defined by the user. So these are the good reference and the bad reference. How far away are you from each? Where's your position in the middle? And this approach, I termed the distance to target method, and it's in the California Water Plan if you want to read more about it. Here's an example of this approach using the CSCI. And so this isn't to say that this is the only way the CSCI should be interpreted, but I interviewed Pete Odie, smart guy, and said, how would you do this? And he said, well, off the record, and I can't really tell you, but here you go. And so I found these several components of the CSCI, the California Student Condition Index. The mean reference value was 1.01. The low, and this might have changed. I talked to him over a year ago. 0.87 was the low end reference value. 0.5 was the stress site mean minus the variance. And 0 is the theoretically worst condition. So if you then score your indicators, you're putting them on a common scale, you're setting a good and a bad reference condition. In this example down here, the good condition is anything above 0.87, so the low end of the reference. So if you're at the low end of the reference and above, you're doing great, you get a score of 100. If you reach the theoretical minimum of 0 biological value, I think that's the theoretical minimum for CSCI, then you get a 0 score. And this is the map of the CSCI values across the state of the HUC-12 scale. It matters how you develop these curves for scoring indicators and renormalizing the data, so you can renormalize them a different way. If you pick a different rule, you might be more strict and say you only get a score of 100 above the mean reference value, which means that some of your reference watersheds will be below 100 score. And a score of 0.5, which is the stress site mean minus the variance, is your 0 value. So it's a much more conservative approach of normalizing the data, and you get a pattern like this. So it's not necessarily a right way to do it. And I'll show you some wrong ways to do it, which have been used here in California, and I won't tell you by who and what the examples are, but I'll just talk about what's wrong with them. So for example, the empirical scaling method takes the minimum value and the maximum value for a parameter and sets those as the good condition and the poor condition. It says that's our universe values. So if we look at this small area here, the smallest value for the CSCI, let's say for the sake of argument, the CSCI was 0.4, the largest value was 0.72. So this gets the best score of 100, dark green. This gets the worst score of 0, dark red. Because this is our universe. So that uses the minimum and maximum values. Let's go to a bigger area and extend our universe and say, well, instead of looking at this sub-watershed, we'll look at the whole watershed. And now we have a much bigger range of values. Our min and max have changed. That will therefore change our scoring system, and a whole other area will become our good, or score of 100. The area that used to be real good right there is now medium, moderate, not so great. The low end may not change very much. Here you can see here. But we have a different area down here that's really, really bad. So by changing the geographic extent, we've changed what our values mean. That's a problem. When you go to talk to a decision maker, a legislator, or a county board person, or the head of NSF, you don't want the extent of your study area to be a driving variable for what your indicators score end up being. This is a common approach used throughout the world. Statistical rescaling, another common approach. You find the mean value in your study area. This is the, so I'm going to keep this example here from empirical just for comparison. It'll show up right here. So this is the empirical method. We find the mean value for all of these. It turns out to be 0.53. 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations away. We use that to find our poor to good set of scores. And we end up with a different pattern using this method than using this method. Both of these methods rely on some characteristics of the parameter values, and they're independent of whether or not we think things are good or poor. So it's another problematic method and commonly used. Okay, back to axiological normalization. In this case, I'll walk through just a little bit. If we use water temperature as one of the easiest examples, if we look at survival of cold water dependent fish, it's generally pretty good, below 19 degrees C, and a bit lower for certain fish or younger fish. And generally we have mortality above temperatures like 25 degrees C. And so our survival curve would look something like this for cold water dependent fish. If we take this concept and we use this as our method for normalizing temperature values, we can then get a score of 0 to 100 or 0 to 1. We use the same curve, the same shape, the same function, and for every temperature, we can find a score, where the score is based on whether or not the fish are surviving. It could be bugs, it could be something else. This would then allow us to take all the water temperatures in the watershed and come up with a score. We've normalized everything to a common scale and found the value. So aggregation into an index is best done using this method, axiological normalization. Okay. Since I'm standing up, I'm going to go fast. I'm going to talk about the final aggregation step, which is summing or averaging. If we think of our index as a composite of these indicator scores, if we're in, let's say, for the sake of argument, 4 different sub-watersheds of a basin, the number of components here, there's 10 components. If we don't determine all of them, we're using summing, we might get different values based on the number of parameters that are occupied by a measurement. So you could have a case where you get the same sum value, but in this case you've got a bunch of missing values. In this case you have more occupied values. So the problem here is that missing values affect the final index score, which means the final index score is not a reflective condition. So the solution is only sum when all values are present, which limits your ability to do the aggregation. Averaging is a common approach. This could be averaging across a space or across measurements. And in this case, the problem is that missing values also affect the final index score. The solution, use average when most values are present. When most values that are present are the same, so you have common values across your different areas, all the things that you're expecting to measure are there. Or you can determine the influence of individual indicators to see if some of them are particularly influential on your average value. Weighting indicators is always done whether or not people say it's done, because if you don't weight your indicators, you're still doing it, you're saying they're all equivalent. And so we're always weighting indicators in an index aggregation, except there are methods where you don't have to do that, which you can talk to me about if you want later. And so basically you're taking some factor, A, B, C, et cetera, and you're multiplying by the indicator, and they could all equal 1. They're all equally weighted. So the best approach or solution to the weighting problem is to test different weighting strategies a priori with users. Don't test it after the fact, because if you start testing it after the fact, that's sort of looking for the best number kind of problem. So talk to stakeholders, users, or just a technical group about what's the best weighting strategy to use, including all the factors equal 1. Finally, this is something that's not really dealt with very well in most indicator work. It is dealt with pretty well in different scientific research, and that's how to deal with things that covary or they're causative. So there could be a correlation between two things that may or may not have a direct relationship, or there may be a direct or causative relationship. Either way, you may end up with a negative or positive covariance among different things. And when you aggregate those values, then without taking into account that things covary, then that's a problem, and that shouldn't be done. But I do it, so people do it, but it shouldn't be done. Okay, so but when you do it, you should at least give people the information that there may be a problem with interpretation of the index because you have aggregated things that covary. This site here, indicators.ucdavis.edu, if it's too dark, so indicators.ucdavis.edu. There's 2 projects on there you can read in much more detail. One is the California Water Plan Project, and the other is the California Forest and Rangelands Assessment Project, which I'm doing right now. But it's got a lot of indicators information, including a catalog of, I think, 1,300 or more indicators that you can query. And so you can look at different tools and things on that site. And if you want to contact me, feel free to do so. Shilling@ucdavis.edu. That's it. Thank you.
Time for a couple of questions.
Guy was saying that.
So about 3 slides from the end where you were summing indicators, and you pointed to, where there's indicators where you don't have data. Are you comfortable with the SWAG, or I forget the term that's in common use here, I've heard others use it, the best expert's best guess, or the best scientific guess in there, or is that something that you feel kind of degrades the output?
It seems like that's 2 different questions. Are you saying, am I comfortable with qualitative information approaches?
Yeah, would that solve the,
I see what you're saying.
The problem here?
Yeah. So yes, it could if you have a way of putting the qualitative information into the same form as these other values. And so if you have a method for doing that, then you're comfortable with its consistency across time and space, which is a problem with some of those methods, then you could bring it into the same equation and maybe solve that. But it has to be then normalized so it's on the same scale as these. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then in general, I think qualitative data has a lot of, or indicators has a lot of value, especially in my work with tribes, for example. They have described historical fish use, that they take advantage of different fish in their traditional rivers and streams. And there are fish species in there that are not in the Pisces database, Pinwell's database for fish, for those streams, because a biologist hadn't happened to have gone there. So the traditional knowledge is that the fish were there, were present, and the UC Davis scientists' knowledge is that it's an absence of a record, which can be interpreted as the absence of the fish. So yes, I think that you can solve that, and I think there's definitely a role for that type of information.
Thank you.
Okay, do you have other questions? Last one. Last question. You got a mic?
I don't have a mic. Can I talk to
There's a
the
mic
mic?
on there, there's a mic.
Fraser, you mentioned that on that one index that you were asked if you could explain it to the Napa County Board of Supervisors, and you said no.
Shall we go back to that one?
Yeah, so if you're working in a regulatory setting, which I think is where we're driving at with bugs, you may have to do something even harder. You may have to explain it to a judge, and I just want people to think about that as we're developing this thing. How are you going to explain it to somebody that's not conversant in the kind of world that we're conversant in?
Well, I've stood in front of 2 judges and explained hard ecological stuff, and judges are usually smart people, and kind of board members can be smart people, probably smarter than Congress people and so on. So I think people can understand it. I didn't want that job, but I think that for people like me and Eric and people in the room, I think it's possible and desirable, because in other cases where they have quantitative information and they're making determinations, it's no more exact than what we do. I mean, if you think of economics, you know, the magic of economics, which they invented in Harry Potter's world, you know, that shows up in courts, world courts. Crime is entirely a value-based, social value-based system. You know, what is a crime, what's not a crime? So I think this definitely is explainable and has a role in those kinds of settings. And yeah, I don't think there's anything problematic. I could take the CSI into a courtroom with enough coaching from Pete and use it. Sure. Why, you want me to do it? Well, thanks.